How did a simmering geopolitical dispute just, well, explode into the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War? It's a conflict that has reshaped international alliances, taken an unimaginable toll, and honestly, it's a question that's weighed heavily on global affairs for years now. Today, we're really digging in. Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, articles, research our own extensive notes, and we distill them down, extracting the most important nuggets of knowledge. Our goal is simple: give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed on this pivotal and, let's face it, often very confusing conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war. So our mission with this deep dive is to unravel the incredibly complex origins, the evolution of this war. We're going to tackle some crucial questions that have really shaped its trajectory. How did this war truly begin, stretching back over a decade now? Who, based on the evidence, the facts presented in our sources, bears responsibility for its length and its devastating impact? What was the real purpose behind agreements like Minsk II? And, well, why did they struggle so much? And how did international involvement, for better or worse, really shape the war's progression and its profound consequences? I am genuinely excited to unpack this multifaceted story with you because there are just so many layers to explore here.
And that excitement is definitely well placed. Because to truly grasp the full picture, we absolutely have to synthesize all this diverse information and critically examine how events evolved over time. This isn't just about the full-scale invasion that shocked everyone in 2022. It's a narrative stretching back a whole decade, marked by these profound political shifts, covert proxy wars, and importantly, the persistent denial of direct involvement by one of the key players. It's a complex tapestry, and understanding its threads is just vital.
Okay, let's unpack this then and rewind the clock. Our deep dive into the Russia-Ukraine war really kicks off in November 2013 with those protests in Kyiv that became known as the Euromaidan. So picture this. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych at the time was signaling he was willing to sign a really important association agreement with the European Union. This was seen as a huge step towards the West for Ukraine, promising deeper economic, political ties. And it came with demands from the Europeans, right? They wanted crucial constitutional and legal reforms, including releasing the opposition leader, Yulia Tymoshenko.
Exactly. It really represented a fork in the road for Ukraine, a clear choice between, let's say, a European future and something else entirely. And what our sources clearly show is that the EU is quite specific in its conditions, really pushing Ukraine toward greater transparency and democratic norms.
That's right. But then, almost overnight, everything changes. After let's say a discreet visit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow, Yanukovych just abruptly reverses course. He decides not to sign the EU agreement. Instead, Ukraine suddenly looks set to join the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. Now, this union, while maybe structurally similar to the EU on paper, was fundamentally designed by Moscow to exert economic and political influence over former Soviet states, pulling them firmly back into Russia's orbit. It was a complete, totally unexpected pivot that left many, many Ukrainians feeling utterly betrayed.
That decision was absolutely a flashpoint. It triggered immediate public outcry. And what's really crucial to grasp here is how swiftly Ukraine's internal political upheaval transformed into something far more geopolitical. Yanukovych's pivot wasn't just a policy shift. It was seen by a huge number of Ukrainians as the direct assault on their national sovereignty and, frankly, their desired future.
Absolutely. The reaction was almost instantaneous. Within hours of Yanukovych's about-face, young people, alerted by social media, texts, you name it, flooded into Kyiv's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, that's Independence Square. They quickly set up a protest camp. And while the numbers fluctuated day to day, every Sunday, huge masses converged on the Maidan. At its peak, we're talking about 500,000 people gathering in central Kyiv, a truly immense display of popular dissent. The authorities, they initially deployed the Berkut riot police, and on November 30th, the order came down. Clear the square by force. Dozens were injured in this effort, which ultimately didn't even work. But here's the critical point, and it's something our sources highlight again and again. That brutal assault didn't quell the protests at all. It just re-energized them, drawing even more people to the cause, making them angrier.
Indeed. And it's important to note how quickly Russia attempted to capitalize on this burgeoning crisis and exert its influence. On December 16th, Putin offered Ukraine a substantial financial package, $15 billion in loans, and, critically, reduced gas prices. Now, this was clearly aimed at offsetting Ukraine's severe financial shortfalls. Their hard currency reserves were nearly depleted. But these weren't just economic handouts. They were explicit political levers designed to keep Ukraine within Moscow's sphere of influence, a direct countermove to the EU aspirations echoing from the Maidan protesters.
And things escalated even further, didn't they? Pushing the conflict beyond just peaceful protests. On January 16, 2014, the Ukrainian parliament, under Yanukovych, enacted what were quickly dubbed these draconian anti-protest laws. These measures severely limited freedom of speech, assembly, they outlawed NGOs, and essentially established a virtual dictatorship overnight. Although they were repealed just 12 days later due to immense public pressure, these measures didn't intimidate the protesters. In fact, they steeled their resolve even further. Yanukovych, in a desperate effort to save his rule, even tried concessions. He removed Prime Minister Mykola Azarov, offered government posts to prominent opposition leaders like Arseniy Yatsenyuk and Vitaly Klitschko, but both unequivocally declined. They weren't buying it.
This period also saw a darker, much more violent side emerge. The government actually brought in armed gangs, thugs really, from cities like Kharkiv and Donetsk into Kiev. These groups then engaged in acts of intimidation and violence, burning cars, beating protesters, even kidnapping journalists. In response, the opposition formed its own local militias, including, yes, some rightist groups like Right Sector, partly to defend themselves in the protest movement. And the makeup of the protest shifted dramatically, too. It wasn't just 20-something students anymore. It became more hardened individuals, people in their 30s and 40s, many coming from Western Ukraine, frankly ready for direct confrontation. Pro-Euromaidan activists began taking over government buildings, not just in Kiev, but right across the country, showing a kind of unified resistance.
And then came that grim climax in February 2014 with a truly horrific bloodshed that just shocked the nation. On February 18th, over 20 people were killed in clashes with police. But that, tragically, was just a hint of what was coming. 2 days later, February 20th, central Kiev became a literal battleground. Government snipers fired on protesters from rooftops, killing at least 80 people and wounding hundreds more. Can you even imagine the sheer terror of that day? But despite the chaos, the immense losses, the Maidan protesters held their ground.
It was a pivotal moment, absolutely.
Yeah.
A line had been crossed, and facing such violence, the international community felt it had to step in. On February 21st, EU foreign ministers arrived in Kiev and managed to broker a deal between Yanukovych and the opposition leaders. This agreement proposed a national unity government within 10 days, crucial constitutional reforms to reduce presidential powers by reinstating the 2004 Constitution, and new presidential elections by December 31st. Yanukovych was supposed to stay on as president until those elections. Even Putin, interestingly, in a phone call with U.S. President Barack Obama, appeared to support this deal, ostensibly, for de-escalation.
And this leads us to the pivotal moment that just reshaped the entire conflict. The very next day, February 22nd, Yanukovych fled Kyiv. Just like that, he was gone. Parliament immediately responded. They stripped him of office, ordered Yulia Tymoshenko's release from prison, and appointed Alexander Turchinov as acting president. New presidential elections were swiftly called for May 25th. The rapid collapse of Yanukovych's government left this power vacuum, and what our sources reveal quite clearly is that Russia wasted absolutely no time in exploiting it.
That's the critical pivot point, isn't it? From what our sources indicate, it really seems Russia had a plan ready to go. This immediately raises a crucial question. What were Russia's immediate strategic goals right after Yanukovych was removed? And how did they try to legitimize their actions on the world stage, especially given they outwardly seemed to support that EU brokered deal just days before?
This is exactly where we see Russia's direct, overt actions begin, setting the stage for everything that followed. Just 5 days after Yanukovych fled, on February 27th, heavily armed troops took over the parliament and government buildings in Simferopol, Crimea. These were the infamous little green men, called that because they had no insignia on their uniforms, making their origin initially ambiguous, though everyone suspected. The Kremlin, of course, initially issued numerous, frankly, implausible denials, but these gunmen were later unequivocally confirmed to be Russian military personnel.
And their actions were incredibly swift and decisive, showing a clear, coordinated strategy. They installed a new prime minister, Sergei Aksyonov, even though his party had received only about 4% of the vote in the most recent elections, a pretty clear indication of a puppet government being set up. Then, members of a self-declared Crimean militia, backed by the 25,000 troops and sailors from Russia's Black Sea Fleet, strategically based right there in Sevastopol, proceeded to take over government buildings and military installations, forcing the surprised Ukrainian units stationed there to surrender. The speed and precision were, frankly, quite remarkable.
And to give this, let's call it what it was, a covert invasion and a legal annexation, a sheen of legitimacy, as our sources phrase it, a widely criticized referendum was hastily held on March 16th. It reported that over 95% of voters supported joining the Russian Federation. A widely criticized referendum for very good reason. It was conducted under military occupation and lacked any international credibility whatsoever.
Precisely. The outcome was absolutely predetermined. Putin then moved quickly to formalize these changes, asserting complete control. On April 2nd, he formally revoked the 2010 Kharkiv Accords, which had given Ukraine that discount on Russian natural gas in exchange for basing rights in Crimea, effectively punishing Ukraine for its European choice. Then on May 9th, a highly symbolic gesture. He celebrated Victory Day, the holiday marking the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, with a very public visit to Sevastopol. This was a clear message of Russian dominance and historical claim over the region. Putin's justification for these actions was consistent and, frankly, quite audacious. He maintained that a pro-Nazi junta had taken power in Kyiv and was targeting Russian speakers. These statements, supported by what our sources call scant evidence, were nevertheless repeated at length over subsequent years. Propaganda in Russian media reached, well, absurd heights. This narrative, regardless of its factual basis, was absolutely central to Russia's initial rationale for intervention and became a cornerstone of their ongoing disinformation campaign for years.
What's truly remarkable as we dug through these sources is that even as Russia was consolidating its grip on Crimea throughout the spring of 2014, another crisis, maybe even more dangerous, was already brewing. It's almost as if Russia had this multi-stage plan ready to unfold in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbas region. This wasn't just some local unrest anymore. It quickly morphed into a full-blown armed conflict, fueled by Russian proxy forces.
Indeed. This represents a direct extension of Russia's strategy, shifting from that outright annexation we saw in Crimea to a more covert, proxy-driven conflict designed to destabilize Ukraine from within. This leads us to a crucial question. How did these separatist movements gain traction so quickly? And what role did external actors, specifically Russia, play in their rapid escalation into armed rebellion?
Well, it began with small, often heavily armed groups of men taking over administrative buildings in the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, and also Kharkiv initially. Then on May 11th, these separatists held what they called referenda, again, highly questionable, and declared the formation of autonomous people's republics in Donetsk, the DNR, and Luhansk, the LNR. Interestingly, the separatist movement in Kharkiv largely fizzled out, which suggests maybe a difference in local support or perhaps less direct external backing there. But in the Donetsk basin, the Donbas, the fighting between these Russian-backed militias and Ukrainian government forces intensified dramatically. Dozens of pro-Russian separatists were killed in a brutal battle over Donetsk's international airport, setting a grim, violent precedent for everything that was to come.
The Ukrainian response quickly became more formalized, naturally. On May 25th, the chocolate magnate Petro Poroshenko easily won the Ukrainian presidential election, though, as you mentioned, much of Crimea and the actively contested Donbas couldn't participate. Poroshenko immediately promised to step up an anti-terrorist operation, or ATO, to regain control of the occupied territories. What's crucial here, from our sources, is that these new separatist governments in the occupied regions were very quickly taken over by militants, including many individuals from Russia. The most prominent among them was Strelkov, the nom de guerre of Igor Girkin, a former colonel with the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB. He set up his headquarters in Slovyansk. This direct involvement of former Russian intelligence personnel really highlights the external hand guiding these supposedly separatist movements.
And the ATO, well, it did see some early progress, at least initially. Poroshenko was inaugurated on June 7th and immediately introduced a peace proposal, but the fighting just continued relentlessly. Government forces reclaimed Mariupol on June 13th, which was a significant victory, and ATO forces liberated Slavyansk on July 5th. However, Strelkov and about 8,000 of his men didn't surrender or disappear. They simply moved their base to the city of Donetsk, indicating the fluidity of the conflict and, frankly, Russia's continued influence over these forces. It was becoming less about defeating them quickly and more about trying to contain a persistent, externally backed insurgency.
This leads us directly to one of the most tragic and internationally condemned events of this entire period. The downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 on July 17th near Lvov. Units under Strelkov's command were definitively found to be responsible for this horrific act, which killed all 298 people aboard, most of whom were Dutch citizens. Strelkov reportedly resigned and left Ukraine on August 14th, seemingly under some duress after the international outcry. A Dutch inquiry later determined, without a doubt, that the aircraft was shot down by a Russian-made Buk surface-to-air missile system. Strelkov and 2 others were eventually found guilty of murder by a Dutch court in November 2022. The international community, understandably outraged, responded quickly. By the end of July, the EU and the US significantly increased sanctions on Russia, freezing bank accounts, banning travel for prominent officials, a clear signal of the severe consequences attached to such actions.
The conflict then escalated even further, with direct Russian military involvement becoming undeniable, despite the Kremlin's persistent, almost reflexive denials. In late August, regular Russian troops, were talking actual Russian army units, not just proxies, entered Ukraine and surrounded Ukrainian forces at Ilovaisk, leading to the deaths of hundreds, possibly thousands, of Ukrainian soldiers in what many called a massacre, despite overwhelming evidence of direct Russian participation, including captured Russian soldiers and identified equipment. The Kremlin just continued to insist that it was not intervening in Ukraine. The sheer scale of the Russian intervention and the heavy losses it inflicted forced Poroshenko to abandon the initial ATO operation, especially after separatist forces, likely reinforced by Russia, opened a new front that directly threatened the strategic port city of Mariupol again.
This grim military reality on the ground forced a diplomatic attempt at de-escalation, even as the fighting intensified. On September 5th, representatives from Ukraine, Russia, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and the two breakaway republics met in Minsk, Belarus. They concluded a ceasefire agreement known as the Minsk Protocol, or Minsk First. It was an acknowledgement of the dire situation. But for Ukraine, it was also a deeply uncomfortable negotiation, with what were, effectively, Russian proxies operating on their soil.
Politically, things kept moving rapidly on both sides. Snap parliamentary elections in Ukraine on October 26th bolstered the pro-European parties, with Yatsenyuk's People's Front and the Poroshenko bloc winning the most votes, signaling the country's continued Western orientation despite the war. But then, on November 2nd, the DNR and LNR held their own illegitimate elections for so-called People's Councils, with separatist leaders Alexander Zakharchenko and Igor Plotnitsky claiming victory. This just highlighted the deep, competing claims of legitimacy and sovereignty that were tearing the region apart.
And despite repeated violations by both sides, a clear sign that the agreement was incredibly fragile at best, the Minsk Protocol technically remained in place through mid-December. This was probably a testament more to the lack of viable alternatives than any real belief in achieving peace through it. Poroshenko's government faced this immense challenge, simultaneously trying to introduce radical reforms, tackle endemic corruption, all while dealing with an unpredictable adversary in Moscow, pulling the strings in the east. And complicating things further, right-wing militants, largely shut out of the formal political process in Kyiv, remained prominent in street fighting and within the Ukrainian volunteer battalions, adding another layer to the internal security picture for Kyiv.
And the humanitarian consequences by the end of that year, 2014, were truly dire, painting a grim picture of the conflict's human cost. Over 4,700 people had been killed and more than 10,000 wounded in just a few months of intense fighting. An estimated 700,000 refugees had fled from the Donbass just into Russia, with thousands more displaced inside Ukraine itself. The UN labeled the situation for civilians trapped in the DNR and LNR as extremely dire due to indiscriminate artillery fire and severely limited access to basic services like heat, water, and electricity as winter set in. It was a multi-layered crisis unfolding with devastating consequences.
The failure of Minsk wasn't just about, say, a lack of commitment from either side. Our sources strongly suggest it exposed a fundamental, irreconcilable chasm. For Ukraine, the goal was always restoring sovereignty and territorial integrity. For Russia, it seemed to be about cementing influence and creating a frozen conflict, a buffer zone. This inherent difference in objectives, rather than just broken promises on ceasefires, likely doomed the agreement from the start. It pushed the conflict into that protracted frozen state that even Minsk II struggled to thaw later on. That's a core insight here. These peace talks often just reflect the underlying unresolved political wills. This leads us to a critical look at Minsk II. What was the new plan? Why, despite its intentions, did it also lead to years of this frozen conflict instead of lasting peace? And how did this stalemate shape the landscape for Ukraine's new leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, when he came to power?
That's a crucial distinction, those irreconcilable goals. So on February 12th, 2015, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany, the so-called Normandy format, hoping to salvage some form of peace, agreed on a 12-point plan dubbed Minsk II. It proposed, again, a cessation of fighting, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, the release of prisoners, and crucially, the removal of foreign troops from Ukrainian territory, which was a direct, though perhaps diplomatically veiled, call to Russia to end its covert military involvement. And for a time, a tenuous peace, as the sources call it, did indeed hold. Heavy weapons were pulled back by both sides in early September 2015.
However, this peace was indeed extremely tenuous, more like a pause in hostilities than a genuine resolution. Frequent violations of the truce continued relentlessly, resulting in over 9,000 dead and more than 20,000 wounded by the end of 2015 alone. Despite Ukrainian authorities estimating over 2,000 Russian troops had been killed in action since April 2014, Russian officials consistently, almost pathologically, denied any involvement, deepening their pattern of disavowal. And in a very telling move, in May 2015, Putin signed a decree banning the release of information about the deaths of Russian soldiers during special operations, clearly an effort to suppress evidence of their casualties and maintain the fiction of non-involvement. This period also saw the rise of hybrid warfare tactics extending far beyond the battlefield. In December 2015, Russian hackers successfully cut electricity to some 225,000 people in western Ukraine. Additional, increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure would follow, as the war in the Donbass settled into that state of frozen conflict for the next 6 years, a simmering wound that never truly healed, constantly undermining Ukrainian stability.
So fast forward to 2019, and we see the unexpected, almost meteoric rise of Volodymyr Zelensky, a truly fascinating character. An actor and comedian, he was best known for portraying this kind of everyman who accidentally becomes president in his hit TV show, Servant of the People. Oh. Life truly imitated art, as Zelensky's powerful anti-corruption platform earned him widespread public support, and he defeated the incumbent Poroshenko in a landslide presidential election. Zelensky, clearly sensing the public's deep desire for an end to the conflict, pledged to bring the simmering war in the Donbass to a close.
But his efforts were immediately complicated by external factors, specifically being drawn into a very thorny U.S. political scandal. The U.S. Congress had authorized some $400 million in military aid for Ukraine, absolutely crucial support for its ongoing defense against Russian aggression. But U.S. President Donald Trump held up the release of that security assistance. In a now infamous phone call with Zelensky in July 2019, Trump implied that the aid would only be released if Zelensky would do us a favor by endorsing unsubstantiated claims about Trump's political opponents, a clear quid pro quo demand, leveraging vital military aid for domestic political gain. Zelensky, to his credit, never provided the requested quid pro quo. He steadfastly refused to be drawn into U.S. domestic politics. The funds were finally made available in September 2019, but the damage was done. This ultimately led the U.S. House of Representatives to launch impeachment proceedings against Trump in December 2019, highlighting just how intertwined Ukraine's fate had become with volatile international politics.
And this political entanglement, coupled with years of a frustratingly frozen conflict, brought about a significant and very clear shift in Ukraine's official stance towards Russia and, importantly, towards NATO. In September 2020, Zelensky approved a new national security strategy. This strategy unambiguously labeled Russia as an aggressor and, for the first time, explicitly identified NATO membership as one of Ukraine's key defense and foreign policy goals. No more ambiguity.
This was a crucial declarative shift, moving beyond any previous hedging. Previous official statements from Kyiv had often left significant room for negotiation with Moscow, and Zelensky himself had initially harbored hopes for a diplomatic resolution early in his term. However, in clear recognition of Russia's continued hybrid warfare campaign against Ukraine, that toxic blend of cyber attacks, disinformation, and covert military action, this new framework explicitly called for mediated talks between the two governments, rather than any attempts at direct bilateral engagement. It effectively hardened Ukraine's strategic stance and set a clear, unyielding direction for its future security and its definitive alignment with Western democratic principles and institutions.
So the conflict had been frozen for years, right? Punctuated by sporadic fighting, constant cyber attacks, simmering tensions. But then in late 2021, something shifted dramatically, and the world started watching with, frankly, bated breath. This brings us right up to the full-scale invasion of 2022. What led to this monumental escalation? What were Russia's escalating demands in the months leading up to it? What were the signals that a full-scale invasion was imminent? And how did Western powers try to counter Russia's narrative before the first shots were even fired?
The signals were undeniably ominous, almost textbook invasion preparation. It began with a massive and unmistakable Russian military buildup. Between October and November 2021, Russia started deploying a huge number of troops and military equipment right along its border with Ukraine. Over the following months, additional forces were dispatched to Belarus supposedly for joint exercises with Belarusian forces, to the Russian-backed separatist enclave of Transnistria in Moldova, and of course to Russian-occupied Crimea. By February 2022, Western defense analysts estimated that as many as 190,000 Russian troops were encircling Ukraine on three sides, warning that an incursion was imminent. Putin, for his part, just dismissed these accusations, claiming a simultaneous Russian naval buildup in the Black Sea was merely a previously scheduled exercise. The denials, even the satellite images clearly showed the buildup, were chillingly unconvincing.
And despite Western leaders consulting frantically with both Zelensky and Putin in an increasingly desperate effort to stave off what appeared to be an inevitable invasion, Putin issued a set of essentially non-negotiable demands. These included de facto veto power over any future NATO expansion and the containment of NATO forces to countries that had been members prior to 1997. Now, this would effectively remove the NATO security umbrella from Eastern and Southern Europe, as well as the Baltic states, fundamentally reshaping European security architecture in Russia's favor. These proposals were, as our sources state, flatly rejected by NATO and its allies. In an unprecedented move, British and American intelligence services took the bold step of pre-bunking Russia's manufactured casus belli, essentially, exposing Russia's false pretext for war by revealing classified information about Russia's true intentions to the public before the invasion even happened, trying to head off the propaganda.
Yet even that extraordinary measure wasn't enough to deter Putin. On February 21st, 2022, he responded by formally recognizing the independence of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. He then brazenly ordered Russian troops into Ukrainian territory, calling them peacekeepers, making Russian military activity in the Donbass, which, let's be clear, had been ongoing covertly since 2014, but consistently disavowed by the Kremlin at last overt and undeniable. Western leaders, pledging immediate solidarity with Ukraine, responded by levying a raft of severe sanctions against Russian financial institutions, aiming to cripple their economy from the outset.
And then the invasion began in earnest. In the early hours of February 24th, Zelensky, in a really powerful and impassioned plea speaking directly in Russian, addressed the Russian people, appealing for peace but vowing that Ukraine would absolutely defend itself. Later that day, around 6:00 a.m. Moscow time, Putin took to the airwaves to announce the beginning of a special military operation. Within minutes, explosions were heard in major cities across Ukraine, and air raid sirens began to wail in Kyiv, signaling the start of Europe's largest land war since World War II. Around the world, leaders condemned the unprovoked attack in the strongest possible terms and promised swift and severe sanctions against Russia. Zelensky immediately declared martial law and called for a general mobilization of Ukraine's military-age population, signaling a fight to the bitter end.
It seemed very clear that Putin's initial plan was to seize Kiev in a matter of days, perhaps even hours, and install a pro-Moscow puppet government. In the early hours of the invasion, an elite Russian paratrooper unit captured Hostomel Airport, just 6 miles northwest of the capital, in a swift airborne assault. Teams of mercenary assassins from the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group were even dispatched into Kiev with specific orders to eliminate key figures in the Ukrainian government, including Zelensky himself. It was a classic decapitation strike attempt, aiming to paralyze the Ukrainian leadership.
But Zelensky's defiance became truly legendary, an inspiration worldwide. Despite the obvious immense personal danger, he remained in the capital, famously filming himself on the street with his advisors, debunking Russian propaganda claims that he had fled. When the United States, concerned for his safety, offered to evacuate him from the combat zone, Zelensky reportedly delivered that line that instantly became iconic. "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." That single statement just perfectly captured the fierce spirit of Ukrainian resistance.
And perhaps surprisingly to many, the initial Russian advance quickly stalled, almost immediately running into problems. Russian troops pouring in from Belarus crossed the border and occupied the Chernobyl nuclear plant as part of a general advance on Kyiv from the north. Russian forces pushing up from Crimea managed to capture Kherson on March 2nd. But that would turn out to be the only regional capital taken by the Russians in that entire initial offensive. Elsewhere, the Russian advance simply stalled in the face of determined, agile Ukrainian defense. An attempted Russian encirclement of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, failed despite its close proximity to the Russian border. And the main thrust toward Kyiv, the key objective, just collapsed due to stiff Ukrainian resistance and, frankly, obvious shortcomings in Russia's logistics capabilities. They were overly reliant on roads, their supply lines were vulnerable, and they couldn't sustain their forward units with adequate fuel and ammunition. This was a critical, embarrassing early failure for Russia.
The human cost quickly mounted, tragically, leading to a profound humanitarian catastrophe almost overnight. Millions of Ukrainians fled the country as Russia indiscriminately targeted civilian populations with rockets and artillery strikes, a brutal tactic aimed at terrorizing the population. By late March, just a month in, some 4 million Ukrainians had fled, representing Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. The overwhelming majority found safety in neighboring Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic, a testament to European solidarity in the face of aggression.
And the atrocities being reported were horrifying, deeply staining Russia's invasion from the very start. On March 16th, as many as 600 people were killed in the besieged city of Mariupol when a Russian airstrike leveled the Donetsk Academic Regional Drama Theater. It was widely known the building was being used as the city's main bomb shelter for families, and the word children was painted on the pavement outside in massive Cyrillic letters, visible even in satellite imagery. This deliberate targeting of civilians was an undeniable war crime.
As the war entered its second month, the offensive against Kiev had clearly grossly miscarried. Russian paratroopers at Hostomel were isolated and eventually destroyed. Russian troops occupying the Kiev suburbs of Irpin and Busha conducted a horrifying campaign of violence against civilian populations. After the Russians were forced to withdraw from these areas under Ukrainian pressure, Ukrainian forces uncovered mass graves, bodies showing clear signs of torture, summary executions, and other irrefutable evidence of war crimes. Elsewhere, the Russians deliberately targeted cultural sites, hospitals, water treatment plants, and other critical civilian infrastructure in brazen violation of the Geneva Conventions. Looting of civilian homes and businesses was also widespread in occupied areas, painting a picture of systemic brutality and disregard for international law.
The world watched in horror, yes. But crucially, it also responded with unprecedented speed and scale, at least initially. Despite Russia's apparent overwhelming military advantage on paper, the West rapidly rallied to support Ukraine. This brings us to a crucial turning point, where Ukrainian resilience, fueled by an immense surge of international support, began to fundamentally shift the war's trajectory. What factors contributed to Ukraine's surprisingly robust defense, and how did the international community's response evolve to counter Russia's military efforts and its global narrative?
On paper, yeah, the Russian military appeared to have this overwhelming advantage in both personnel and material, the tanks, the artillery, the planes. But the West quickly responded, providing Ukraine with billions of dollars in military aid almost immediately. Zelensky, often appearing in that now iconic olive drab t-shirt, became a global symbol of resistance. He appealed directly to governments and intergovernmental organizations around the world through powerful video calls, warning that a new Iron Curtain was descending on Europe, a chilling echo of the Cold War that resonated deeply.
What's truly illuminating from our sources is that Ukraine's military performance wasn't solely dependent on foreign assistance, as vital as that aid obviously was and continues to be. Many of those defending Ukraine had earned invaluable combat experience fighting Russian proxies in the Donbass since 2014, giving them a hardened, battle-tested edge. In addition, Ukraine's military underwent extensive reforms in the crucial years since Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, and defense spending increased sharply during that time, building a more professional, NATO interoperable force. Zelensky had also ordered a crucial overhaul of Ukroboronprom, the state-owned concern controlling Ukraine's defense industry, which had been, frankly, plagued by scandals. This restructuring led to renewed confidence and strategic partnerships with international firms like Lockheed Martin, allowing Ukraine to significantly boost its own domestic defense capabilities.
And the advances made by Ukraine's own military-industrial complex were perhaps most dramatically displayed on April 13, 2022. That's when the Moskva, a Russian-guided missile cruiser and the flagship of the entire Black Sea fleet, was struck by a pair of Ukrainian-produced Neptune anti-ship missiles off the coast of Odessa. Russian authorities, in classic fashion, claimed it was just an ammunition fire on board, but the ship sank the very next day. This provided an enormous morale boost for Ukraine, a truly symbolic victory against a major naval power, and it further undermined the perception of Russia as a near-peer adversary of the United States. The loss of the Moskva also significantly degraded Russia's ability to project force in the western Black Sea, as it was the only vessel in the Black Sea fleet equipped with long-range anti-air defenses, leaving other Russian ships dangerously vulnerable.
Now, while fighting intensified in the Donbass, and Ukraine successfully launched a counteroffensive near Kharkiv in May, the strategic port city of Mariupol finally surrendered after a nearly 3-month siege that had reduced the entire city to ruins. The final holdouts, a mixed force of Ukrainian defenders, including the controversial Azov regiment, occupied the massive Azovstal steel plant. The brutal fighting there, house to house, tunnel to tunnel, underground, led observers to chillingly recall the Battle of Stalingrad from World War II. Ukrainian officials estimate at least 20,000 civilians had been killed in the siege of Mariupol, and over 90% of its structures damaged or destroyed, a truly horrific, staggering toll.
Russia's reliance on attrition warfare in the Donbass, that's when you try to wear down the enemy through sheer force and continuous costly attacks rather than trying to outmaneuver them, was dictated by several critical factors, as our sources really highlight. As demonstrated in that failed Kyiv offensive early on, Russia couldn't count on its armored units to successfully execute even the basic elements of a maneuver warfare campaign that's using speed and agility to outflank and encircle the enemy. Instead, they were forced into these grinding, incredibly costly frontal assaults. They were overly reliant on roads, making them predictable. They were dependent on Russia's fragile logistics and supply system for fuel and ammunition, which often broke down under Ukrainian attack. Even Russia's most advanced tanks proved surprisingly vulnerable to highly effective Ukrainian anti-tank guided missile ATGM teams, which were nimble, well-trained, and adaptable. Despite an overwhelming numerical advantage in aircraft, the Russian Air Force completely failed to establish air superiority in any major combat theater, leaving their ground forces dangerously exposed from above. This also left Russian armor incredibly vulnerable to Ukraine's formidable and growing armada of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, ranging from readily available modified consumer drones used for reconnaissance and dropping small bombs, to the more sophisticated Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 strike drones. Also, crucially, the near-total global embargo on advanced processors leveled on Russia ensured that any sophisticated computerized equipment lost in combat could scarcely be replaced, hobbling their long-term military modernization efforts.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Putin's special military operation saw a series of truly stunning failures early on. The collapse of Russia's main thrust toward Kiev, the deaths of at least a dozen Russian generals, an absolutely unheard-of number for such a conflict in modern times, and of course the sinking of the Moskva, the largest warship lost to enemy action since the Falkland Islands War back in 1982. Russia rapidly became the most heavily sanctioned country in history, increasingly isolated from the international banking system, with its airspace closed by the EU, the US, the UK, and Canada. Ukraine, conversely, was embraced by the West as a developing democracy bravely defending itself against the depredations of an autocratic neighbor. Western leaders flocked to Kiev to demonstrate solidarity and pledge continued support, a stark contrast to Russia's growing pariah status on the world stage.
In June 2022, the U.S. significantly stepped up its military aid by sending an initial shipment of high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, to Ukraine. This platform offered much greater accuracy and longer range than any comparable weapon in the Russian arsenal at the time. Ukrainian troops were soon using them with devastating effect, striking critical supply depots and command and control centers far behind the front lines, severely disrupting Russian logistics and operations. A dozen HIMARS were operational by July, and they would prove absolutely crucial in the upcoming Ukrainian summer offensive, becoming a real game-changer on the battlefield.
On June 23rd, in a major symbolic and political victory, Ukraine was granted candidate status, an important first step on the long path to full membership in the European Union, a clear signal of Europe's long-term commitment to Ukraine's future. And NATO, the very alliance Putin sought to weaken and divide, which some had even decried as irrelevant in the 21st century, found a renewed purpose and sense of solidarity in the wake of the Russian invasion. Finland and Sweden, two countries with long, proud histories of neutrality, each signaled their intention to join the alliance shortly after the war began, a direct consequence of Russia's aggression. On July 5th, both countries signed their accession protocols. Instead of shattering the alliance's will and dividing its members, Putin had, in effect, turned the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, strengthening the very alliance he aimed to undermine. A classic case of strategic blowback.
That's a truly ironic outcome, isn't it? It's fascinating. As we consider this conflict, what really strikes us from the sources is that in an era marked by unprecedented information warfare, the battle for narratives became almost as important as the actual ground war. How did that meme war, as it was called, play out? And what surprising impact did it actually have, especially as it coincided with Ukraine's strategic counteroffensives that really started to change the map?
Well, Russia's information warfare capability had certainly been established long before the open hostilities in Ukraine. Moscow's efforts to interfere in things like the Brexit referendum, the 2016 U.S. presidential election, and the 2017 French presidential election were very well documented. However, the Russian disinformation campaign specifically against Ukraine, particularly their bizarre denazification claims, was, as our sources put it, farcical on its face and gained little traction outside Russian state media. It was almost comically inept at times, failing to resonate internationally.
It truly was something else. Putin attempted to portray Russia's aggression as this noble effort to denazify a country whose democratically elected leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, was Jewish and had actually lost relatives in the Holocaust. The absurdity was just blatant. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov even sparked a major diplomatic row with Israel when he tried to support Putin's assertion, repeating a long discredited anti-Semitic trope that Hitler also had Jewish blood and stating, "Wise Jewish people say that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews." It was a truly offensive and, frankly, desperate attempt to twist history to justify their invasion.
And perhaps surprisingly, the Kremlin-backed Troll Farm, the Internet Research Agency, which was linked to the oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, struggled to spread Moscow's narrative more broadly or effectively online. This is where the unexpected and highly effective meme war comes into play. Pro-Russian messages online, even those coming from official Russian government accounts, were consistently met with this torrent of derisive, humorous replies from the North Atlantic Fellows Association, or NAFO. This was a loosely organized, decentralized collective of pro-Ukrainian posters, united by their distinctive cartoon Shiba Inu avatars. These fellas, as they call themselves, were ubiquitous on Twitter, and their meme campaign against Russian disinformation was startlingly successful, using humor and mockery to deflate and counter state-sponsored propaganda.
Absolutely. The reach and impact were undeniable. Government and military officials in Ukraine and even the United States, as well as Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, publicly voiced their support for the group by adopting fella avatars themselves, lending it this almost surreal air of official endorsement. NAFO members also demonstrated their impact beyond just memes, donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to Ukrainian defense forces and charities. These charitable efforts led NAFO to partner with St. Javelin, that meme-based fundraising operation launched by Canadian journalist Christian Bories. Bories created St. Javelin, a stylized Orthodox Madonna figure holding a Javelin anti-tank guided missile, and initially printed them on stickers in an effort to raise just $500 for humanitarian aid. In what was perhaps the first military conflict to truly weaponize memes on such a scale, St. Javelin became a powerful asset for the Ukrainian side. Boris' operation expanded dramatically into a full clothing shop, featuring items depicting various saints wielding Western weapon systems, and his total contribution to Ukraine soon topped an astonishing $1 million. It was mobilization through merchandise.
Meanwhile, back on the actual battlefield, the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive of 2022 showed remarkable results, demonstrating their evolving capabilities and strategic thinking. On June 30th, Russian forces were decisively driven from Snake Island, or Sminy Island, that small but strategically vital outcropping in the western Black Sea. Its occupation had given Russia significant leverage, including monitoring shipping lanes and launching missile attacks. Its recapture significantly degraded Russia's ability to project force in the western Black Sea, opening up new possibilities for Ukraine, particularly for grain exports. The Russian Defense Ministry, in an utterly absurd attempt to save face, tried to characterize their retreat as simply a gesture of goodwill toward Ukraine, a claim that was widely ridiculed internationally.
In the east, Russian forces did capture Lysychansk in the first week of July, after weeks of relentless, indiscriminate bombardment, along with neighboring Severodonetsk. The fall of these two industrial cities gave Russia control of the last remaining major population centers in Luhansk Oblast. This, however, would prove to be the high watermark of Russia's offensive in the Donbas, the furthest extent of their significant territorial gains in that phase. Russian attackers would then spend the next 6 months attempting these sanguinary assaults, that's incredibly bloody, costly attacks on the heavily fortified Ukrainian stronghold at Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast, largely without success, grinding down their own forces in the process.
While Bakhmut held firm, Ukrainian forces launched bold counterstrokes elsewhere, effectively leveraging their new long-range capabilities provided by Western aid. In late July, those American-supplied HIMARS systems really made their presence known with a series of precise strikes that heavily damaged key bridges around Russian-occupied Kherson. Russian forces stationed on the west bank of the Dnipro River were suddenly in serious danger of being cut off from their supplies and reinforcements. Russian commanders were forced to shift their attention away from the stalled Donbas offensive to reinforce their beleaguered units in the south. Then, on August 9th, a massive explosion rocked a Russian airbase in occupied Crimea, destroying as many as 9 combat aircraft and sending Russian holidaymakers who were vacationing there fleeing in panic. Purportedly the work of Ukrainian Special Operations Forces or local partisan units, this audacious attack led the Russian occupation government in Crimea to declare a state of emergency, a clear sign of their growing vulnerability, even in supposedly secure rear areas. As the buildup around Kherson continued, another HIMARS strike destroyed the headquarters of the Wagner Group in Luhansk, reportedly killing as many as 100 mercenaries.
But the truly stunning offensive, the one that really shocked observers, came on September 6th in the Kharkiv region, taking the Russians completely by surprise. With Russia's attention largely fixed on defending Kherson in the south, the Ukrainians carried out a stunning offensive that exploited thin Russian lines in the northeast. Russian positions simply crumbled under the swift and coordinated Ukrainian advance. In the space of a single week, Ukrainian forces liberated more than 3,400 square miles of territory, a huge swath of land. Izium, which had fallen to the Russians back in April and served as a critical supply hub for their Donbas operations, was recaptured on September 10th. The loss of this vital logistical node was a deep embarrassment for Moscow, and fleeing Russian troops left behind massive stores of weapons and ammunition, which Ukraine quickly captured and repurposed against them. By the time the Ukrainian advance slowed, virtually the entirety of Kharkiv Oblast had been freed from Russian control. Then, on October 1st, Ukrainian forces retook Lyman, a strategic rail center on the Seversky Donets River, further solidifying their gains and putting pressure on Russian positions in Luhansk.
These rapid Ukrainian advances clearly forced Putin's hand, leading to a series of increasingly desperate and often chaotic measures that revealed the true, struggling state of Russia's military and, perhaps more importantly, its internal power dynamics. This included that clumsy partial mobilization and the increasingly prominent and eventually openly rebellious role of the Wagner Group. What insights do our sources offer into how these desperate measures actually impacted Russia's military capability and its internal stability at that critical juncture?
While with his army falling back on multiple fronts and suffering demonstrably heavy casualties, on September 21st, 2022, Putin declared that partial mobilization of 300,000 troops, aiming to bolster his depleted forces. This move starkly contrasted with his earlier denials of the war's true scale and the need for such measures. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed publicly that only veterans with prior combat experience would be called up. However, there was widespread evidence, videos flooding social media showing men with absolutely no military background or even with severe health issues being indiscriminately drafted into the armed services. Putin's announcement triggered a wave of protests across Russia, and in some chilling cases, men arrested at these demonstrations were served with draft notices while still in police custody, a truly coercive tactic. It was estimated that anywhere between 260,000 and 700,000 military-age men actually fled Russia in the wake of the mobilization notice, rather than face conscription and likely death in Ukraine.
And the execution of this mobilization was, as our sources consistently indicate, utterly chaotic and counterproductive. While most professional armies trained recruits for months to be combat ready, some mobiks, as these newly drafted men were derisively nicknamed, were reportedly killed in action just 10 days after receiving their draft notices, thrown onto the front lines with minimal training or equipment. Russian social media was absolutely flooded with videos depicting the mobilization's haphazard and disorganized execution, showing ill-equipped recruits being dispatched to the front in piecemeal fashion, often serving as little more than cannon fodder in brutal frontal assaults. Even Putin's most stalwart defenders in Russian state media voiced their disapproval at the sheer incompetence and human cost. Russia clearly ceded any possible strategic advantage that might have been gained from fresh troops by mishandling this crucial mobilization effort so spectacularly.
As this chaotic mobilization was ongoing, Moscow simultaneously staged what were clearly sham referenda in the occupied Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, held between September 23rd and 27th, supposedly to determine if those regions should join Russia. These were hastily organized elections where, chillingly, reports and videos showed gunmen accompanying poll workers to people's homes, constituting acts of obvious coercion and making a complete mockery of any legitimate democratic process.
The motivation for these sham referenda seems chillingly clear from the timing. The loss of that huge swath of territory in Kharkiv Oblast to the Ukrainian counteroffensive likely forced the Russian occupation authorities to attempt to legitimize their control over these remaining territories before Ukraine could potentially reclaim additional land. As was the case with the staged Crimean referendum 8 years earlier, the alleged outcome announced by Russia overwhelmingly favored annexation, an outcome clearly decided before any supposed votes were cast. However, these referenda were almost universally condemned as illegal by the international community. Putin's formal annexation of the territories, celebrated in a massive, orchestrated, televised rally in Moscow's Red Square on September 30th, was notably vague on specific territorial claims. While Russia had exercised de facto control over large portions of Donetsk and Luhansk since 2014, it held barely half of Zaporizhia province, and its forces were actively in retreat across Kherson province at that very moment. The declarations left unclear how exactly Russia proposed to administer land that was still under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine, highlighting the stark disconnect between Kremlin propaganda and the reality on the ground.
Meanwhile, back in Russia's prisons, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the notorious founder of the Wagner Group, was conducting his own highly public recruiting drive for his mercenary force. A video surfaced on September 13th showing him personally at a penal colony in Yoshkorola, brazenly telling prisoners, "I represent the private military company Wagner. You have probably heard of it." He then openly offered them release from prison in exchange for 6 months of brutal combat duty with Wagner on the front lines in Ukraine.
This video was incredibly notable for several profound reasons, revealing significant shifts in Russian power structures and methods. First, private military companies were, at that time, technically outlawed in Russia, and the Kremlin had repeatedly, vehemently denied any official ties between the state and Wagner. Prigozhin's public statement made it abundantly clear that Putin had effectively authorized the creation of a parallel military structure outside of the regular Russian army, signaling a disturbing new, unconventional approach to warfare, reliant on mercenaries and convicts. Second, Prigozhin himself had previously filed numerous lawsuits against journalists who had accurately tied him to Wagner in the past, fiercely guarding his public image and plausible deniability. However, as Russia's reliance on Wagner mercenaries dramatically increased due to losses in the regular army, it became less necessary for Prigozhin to remain in the shadows. This was evident when Wagner opened a lavish headquarters building in St. Petersburg in October, a very public display of its growing power and influence. Third, and perhaps most disturbingly, prior to the 2022 invasion, Wagner had been primarily a professional force of perhaps 5,000 elite experienced fighters. Prigozhin's aggressive prison recruiting efforts fundamentally transformed Wagner into a convict army numbering some 50,000 by the end of 2022, a massive, brutal, and often tragically disposable fighting force used for human wave attacks.
On October 8, 2022, Ukraine carried out another spectacular high-profile attack, this time on the Kerch Strait Bridge. That's the 12-mile span linking Russia directly with Russian-occupied Crimea. This bridge wasn't just vital infrastructure, it was a potent symbol of Russia's claim to control Crimea and a key supply route for military logistics to the southern front. Analysts concluded it was likely a powerful truck bomb, which destroyed a 900-foot section of the road bridge and simultaneously ignited a fuel tanker train on the adjacent rail bridge, causing massive damage. Russia quickly worked to restore limited traffic, but full repairs were estimated to take almost a full year, highlighting the significant strategic and symbolic blow.
Russia responded, predictably, on October 10th with a furious and brutal retaliation, launching a massive air attack against civilian structures in Ukraine's cities. Scores of cruise missiles and over a dozen Iranian Shahed 136 kamikaze drones struck critical infrastructure facilities, power plants, heating systems, and residential buildings across the country, causing widespread power outages and numerous civilian casualties just as winter was approaching. However, as Russia stepped up its aerial campaign against civilian targets, Ukraine's air defenses, bolstered by Western aid, became more capable and increasingly sophisticated. By November, Ukraine had acquired advanced systems like Nashorns from the U.S., Hawk and Aspeed from Spain, Crowtail from France, and Gepard flak panzers from Germany, the last of which proved especially effective against the slower, low-flying Shahed 136 UAVs. Ukraine claimed intercepting over 500 such drones in the last 4 months of 2022 alone, a testament to their rapidly improving capabilities. The U.S. also pledged the highly sought-after Patriot missile systems by year's end, with Ukrainian crews beginning training in January 2023, signaling a major long-term commitment to enhancing Ukraine's ability to defend its skies.
While Russia continued its brutal bombing campaign against civilian infrastructure throughout the fall and winter, Ukrainian troops steadily increased pressure on the beleaguered Russian garrison in Kherson City, systematically cutting off their supply lines across the Dnipro River. Their strategy of isolating the city was clearly working. In what was perhaps the most dramatic reversal of the war since the sinking of the Moskva, on November 9, 2022, the Kremlin announced the humiliating withdrawal of all Russian troops from Kherson City, the only regional capital they had managed to capture since the full-scale invasion began.
The loss of Kherson was especially humiliating for Putin. Just weeks earlier, after conducting that illegal annexation referendum, he had stood in Moscow and declared that the residents of Kherson would be our citizens forever, formally integrating the region into Russia on paper. Days after Kherson was liberated, a triumphant Zelensky visited the city center, declaring that the Ukrainian victory signaled the beginning of the end of the war. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, however, stubbornly responded by simply repeating the Kremlin line that Kherson is Russian territory, clinging desperately to a narrative that reality on the ground had long since disproven.
Operations on the ground naturally slowed as winter set in, with mud and snow making large offensives difficult. But Ukraine became increasingly bold with strikes deep behind the front lines, showing a new and surprising tactical reach. On December 5th, Ukrainian forces attacked a pair of major air bases deep inside Russia, Engels and Ryazan, using modified Soviet-era reconnaissance drones. These bases were located some 300 miles from Ukrainian territory and hosted elements of Russia's strategic bomber fleet, the planes used to launch cruise missiles at Ukraine. Russia acknowledged that several bombers were damaged and personnel were killed. The psychological effect of these attacks was enormous, revealing a shocking vulnerability deep within Russian territory itself.
What's truly astonishing here from a military perspective is that Russia had long boasted about the supposed strength of its layered air defense network, with its advanced S-400 system widely regarded as one of the most effective surface-to-air missile platforms in the world. The fact that Ukraine had apparently been able to strike at two of the most valuable strategic military sites in Russia using adapted, relatively low-tech 20th century drone technology served as a damning indictment of Russian defense priorities and the actual effectiveness of their capabilities. Another drone attack on December 26th killed 3 more Russian personnel at an airbase. By January 2023, Panzer mobile air defense systems even began appearing conspicuously on rooftops throughout Moscow, a visible sign of growing fear within the capital, though a Russian official quickly decried photographic evidence as fake, attempting to downplay the clear and present threat.
So, as the conflict ground on into 2023 and then into 2024, the dynamics evolved once more. We saw the true unsustainable cost of Russia's attempt to build a war economy, that remarkable and surprising Black Sea naval campaign by Ukraine that really challenged all expectations, and intense internal Russian strife that culminated in that stunning, if brief, Wagner rebellion. But also, frustratingly for Kyiv, continued political challenges in the West to maintaining the vital, uninterrupted flow of international support. After the dramatic shifts of 2022, what really defined this next phase of the conflict, particularly regarding battlefield momentum, those internal Russian struggles, and the state of international aid?
While Russia's much vaunted winter and spring offensives in 2023 essentially went nowhere, the front lines remained largely static throughout that period, despite their continued reliance on costly human wave attacks in places like Bakhmut. Russia's missile and drone campaign against Ukrainian cities did continue relentlessly, constantly raising the civilian death toll, although Ukraine's improving air defenses were intercepting a higher percentage of incoming threats. Meanwhile, Ukraine struggled to duplicate the dramatic battlefield success they had achieved in 2022. And crucially, as our sources emphasize, shortages of ammunition, particularly artillery shells, became acute as U.S. military aid dried up due to political deadlock in Washington. This directly impacted their ability to conduct offensive operations and even hold defensive lines effectively.
The Battle of Bakhmut really defined this period on the ground, didn't it? It became this grinding, incredibly bloody symbol of attritional warfare, almost like a WWI battlefield. Prigozhin's Wagner forces intensified their focus on Bakhmut, seemingly desperate to deliver some kind of tangible victory for Moscow after months of failures. For months, poorly equipped Wagner convict troops conducted bloody human wave attacks trying to encircle the city, literally throwing masses of recently recruited prisoners at heavily fortified Ukrainian defenses. Ukrainian forces held on tenaciously for a very long time, inflicting immense casualties. Finally, in May 2023, the Ukrainians conducted a strategic withdrawal from the completely destroyed ruins of Bakhmut, and Prigozhin declared a hollow victory. It was estimated that Russian casualties in the battle for the strategically minor city exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded, including over 20,000 killed in action. Prigozhin himself later confirmed this was likely a low estimate for Wagner losses alone. Still, it was technically Russia's first significant battlefield success in nearly a year, and Prigozhin's political stock rose accordingly within the Kremlin, despite the absolutely horrific human cost.
But this Pyrrhic victory was almost immediately overshadowed by growing and very public internal infighting within the Russian command structure. The feud between Prigozhin and the established Russian military leadership, particularly Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, had begun simmering during the long siege of Bakhmut. Prigozhin publicly, repeatedly accused defense officials of deliberately withholding vital ammunition and supplies from his mercenaries, even alleging instances of friendly fire incidents between regular Russian forces and Wagner troops. Putin, for his part, did little to dampen the feud, seemingly content to let his subordinates fight amongst themselves, perhaps weakening potential rivals, but ultimately undermining overall military cohesion. The clash reached a dramatic, almost unbelievable climax in late June 2023, when Prigozhin openly declared war on the Russian Defense Ministry. He crossed his forces back into Russia from Ukraine, leading an armored column of some 25,000 Wagner mercenaries in an open challenge to the Russian state itself.
On June 24th, in a truly shocking display that played out live on social media, the Wagner force shot down more than half a dozen Russian military aircraft, including valuable command helicopters, and proceeded to occupy the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, a crucial military command center for the war in Ukraine, without firing a shot in the city itself. While Prigozhin remained in Rostov-on-Don, seemingly negotiating, a separate Wagner column led by Dmitry Utkin, Wagner's shadowy co-founder, and a figure linked to neo-Nazi ideology, headed rapidly north towards Moscow. They encountered no meaningful resistance as they passed through the city of Voronezh before finally halting just 120 miles south of the capital. The road to Moscow seemed wide open, and then, as abruptly and bizarrely as it began, Prigozhin ordered his men to turn back. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko quickly announced he had brokered a deal. Wagner mercenaries would supposedly be granted amnesty and offered contracts with the regular Russian military. Prigozhin himself would live in exile in Belarus. The whole 24-hour event was surreal, a stunning public exposure of deep fractures and fragility within the Russian power system.
The fate of Prigozhin and the Wagner Group seemed highly uncertain in the weeks following that failed mutiny. Prigozhin even brazenly resurfaced in August with a recruitment video apparently filmed at a Wagner garrison somewhere in Africa, clearly suggesting he was still operating independently and hadn't fully submitted to the deal. But then on August 23rd, just 2 months after the mutiny and only days after that video appeared, Prigozhin's private business jet crashed north of Moscow under mysterious circumstances. Prigozhin and Utkin were confirmed dead among the 10 recovered bodies. Wagner-affiliated social media channels immediately claimed the aircraft had been deliberately downed by Russian air defenses, strongly implying state-sponsored assassination. 2 days after Prigozhin's presumed death, Putin issued a decree that compelled all remaining Wagner fighters, wherever they were, to swear a formal oath of allegiance to the Russian state. This effectively brought the powerful mercenary force under the direct control of the regular Russian military, consolidating Putin's control after a significant and very public challenge to his authority.
Western support, meanwhile, continued to grow conspicuously and strategically in the early months of 2023, reflecting a deeper long-term commitment to Ukraine's defense even amidst the political turmoil. The U.S. pledged M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, powerful and versatile platforms, and the U.K. promised a squadron of Challenger 2 main battle tanks, their top-tier tank. Later that month, the U.S. Department of Defense confirmed it would send an entire armored battalion of its own formidable M1 Abrams tanks. Germany, after much internal debate and international pressure, finally dispatched its highly regarded Leopard 2 tanks and, crucially, approved their re-export transfer from other European countries that operated them, a key step, given Germany held the manufacturing veto power. By the end of January 2023, over 300 modern Western main battle tanks had been promised to Kyiv, a truly significant upgrade to their armored capabilities. Another of the Kremlin's supposed red lines was crossed in August 2023 when the U.S. authorized the transfer of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. This represented a noteworthy upgrade to Ukraine's aging Soviet-era air power capabilities, finally allowing them to potentially better contest the skies, though pilot training would take significant time. An F-16 painted in Ukrainian livery was even unveiled in February 2024, symbolizing this coming new capability.
However, a critical challenge emerged regarding U.S. aid that significantly impacted Ukraine's ability to maintain momentum on the battlefield throughout 2023 and into 2024. By the end of 2023, cumulative U.S. military aid to Ukraine approached an impressive $50 billion, but another round of vital funding was blocked by Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives, creating a dangerous gap in supplies. Support for Ukraine among the American public had unfortunately eroded, especially among Republicans, and the Donald Trump-led MAGA movement within the party was becoming broadly pro-Putin, representing a dramatic reversal from the traditional anti-Soviet, anti-Russian stance of the Reagan-era Republicans. Trump himself was openly hostile to NATO, praised Putin on numerous occasions, and in February 2024 controversially said he would encourage the Russians to do whatever the hell they want to NATO members not meeting defense spending targets. Uncertainty swirled intensely around the future of U.S. support, especially after Trump's election victory later in 2024. In response, before the transition of power, Biden's Defense Department began a surge of security assistance, rushing to dispatch all remaining congressionally authorized military aid before Trump potentially took office and altered U.S. policy, trying to preempt future roadblocks and secure as much aid for Ukraine as possible in the interim.
Ukraine's domestic arms industry also received a much-needed shakeup amidst these international aid challenges, aiming for greater self-sufficiency and efficiency. The formal dissolution of Ukroboronprom in June 2023, that notoriously scandal-plagued state-owned defense concern, was a decisive move. It was replaced by Ukrainian Defense Industry, or UDI, a new joint stock company structured more along Western corporate lines. Herman Smetana, a young 31-year-old engineer, was appointed to head it, tasked specifically with battling endemic corruption, boosting domestic production of crucial items like ammunition and those ubiquitous FPV drones, first-person view drones, allowing operators precise targeting via the drone's camera and aligning the industry with international corporate norms to attract investment. A key early partner was the major German defense company Rheinmetall, which entered into a joint venture with UDI in October 2023, pledging ambitiously to build manufacturing plants directly inside Ukraine for armored transports and Lynx infantry fighting vehicles, a major step towards bolstering Ukraine's long-term defense industrial base and reducing reliance on external aid.
While there continued to be widespread international support for Ukraine, Russia and its leaders were becoming increasingly isolated on the global stage, treated more and more like pariahs. The U.S. and the EU strengthened their already extensive sanctions against Russian business owners, oligarchs, and government officials, tightening the economic screws further. Putin retaliated with an edict that effectively authorized the nationalization or seizure of any foreign companies still operating inside Russia, grabbing their assets. Then, on March 17, 2023, in a landmark move with potentially huge long-term consequences, the International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Putin himself, along with the Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. The charge was war crimes related to the mass kidnapping and deportation of Ukrainian children from Russian-occupied areas. Estimates suggested some 20,000 had been abducted and unlawfully transferred to Russia or Russian-held territory, though the true figure could be much higher. This ruling meant Putin's international travel was sharply curtailed, as any ICC member state would technically be obligated to arrest him if he set foot on their soil. Moscow responded, predictably, by issuing its own counter-arrest warrants for ICC judges and officials, but the message of his international pariah status was undeniably clear.
Surprisingly, perhaps paradoxically, given the strength of the international sanctions regime and Moscow's lack of access to many foreign markets, Russia's economy actually reported growth in 2023. How? Well, this expansion was largely fueled by a massive increase in government expenditures, essentially deficit spending, propped up by a steady devaluation of the ruble. They were basically pumping huge amounts of money directly into a burgeoning war economy. Russia's federal budget for 2024 clearly showed a dramatic increase in military spending, up to a staggering 6% of GDP, a clear signal that Putin did not foresee an end to the fighting anytime soon, committing Russia fully to a long, protracted, and costly conflict, regardless of the impact on civilian living standards.
International observers immediately questioned the sustainability of Russia's rapid transition to a full-blown war economy, noting a worrying historical parallel. The IMF managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, observed pointedly, that is pretty much what the Soviet Union used to look like. High level of production of military goods, low level of consumption for the population, calling it not a very good story for the long-term well-being or stability of the Russian people. Russia also remained largely outcast from the mainstream international community. Putin was forced to attend a BRICS summit in South Africa via video conference, due to his outstanding international arrest warrant. Russia's bid to regain a seat on the UN Human Rights Council was overwhelmingly voted down by member states in October 2023. Many international sporting federations maintained their bans on Russian athletes competing under their flag, although the IOC controversially decided to allow them to compete as neutrals in the Olympics, a compromise that satisfied few.
At year's end, Kyiv appeared poised to take the next crucial symbolic step in a journey that began all the way back in the earliest days of the Ukraine crisis, on the Maidan. In December 2023, almost exactly 10 years after the start of that protest movement that brought down the Yanukovych government, the European Union formally opened accession talks with Ukraine. Zelensky hailed the news, quite rightly, as a victory for all of Europe, symbolizing Ukraine's unwavering commitment to its European future, even amidst the brutal realities of ongoing war.
There had been much anticipation, a lot of hope, riding on Ukraine's planned 2023 counteroffensive, a potential turning point. But the harsh reality was that the front lines remained largely unchanged by the end of the year. The campaign plan for the Kherson theater was significantly delayed right at the start, when the Russians deliberately blew up the massive Kakhovka Dam, a major hydroelectric station on the Dnipro River, on June 6th. An immediate ecological disaster unfolded, with one of Europe's largest reservoirs rapidly draining, flooding some 240 square miles downstream, tragically killing scores of people and completely inundating dozens of towns and villages. Up to 1 million people were left without access to drinking water, thousands were displaced from their homes, and tens of thousands of acres of vital agricultural land were ruined. Both Russian and Ukrainian troops positioned along the river were forced to withdraw from the floodwaters, leading to a chaotic scramble to reclaim strategic positions as the waters eventually receded. By October, however, Ukrainian Marines and Special Forces units began launching daring probing attacks across the now wider river onto the left, eastern bank of the Dnipro, eventually securing a significant bridgehead near the village of Crimea by November, a small but tactically important foothold in occupied territory.
Further east, on the Zaporizhia front, Ukrainian troops managed to liberate the heavily fortified town of Robotyne in August, a hard-won advance achieved after months of intense fighting. But the subsequent advance stalled against dense Russian defensive lines, minefields, and fortifications, checking the Ukrainian push short of the strategic hub of Tokmak. Worryingly, growing ammunition shortages, particularly for crucial artillery support, threatened to erase even those hard-fought gains, with Russian forces managing to retake some territory in that sector in early 2024. In the Donbass, meanwhile, combat became intensely centered on Avdiivka, a heavily fortified industrial city near Donetsk that had been on the front lines since 2014 and was now reduced almost entirely to ruins by constant bombardment. In October 2023, two full Russian field armies were tasked with capturing the city at any cost, launching massive assaults in what quickly became a virtual repeat of the Battle of Bakhmut in its sheer brutality, human wave tactics, and horrific cost in lives. At least 13,000 Russian troops were estimated killed or wounded in just the first 2 months of the Avdiivka offensive. Ukraine's elite 47th Mechanized Brigade, equipped with those newly arrived Western Leopard 2 tanks and M2 Bradley IFVs, inflicted incredible losses on the Russian attackers, reportedly destroying over 350 Russian tanks and some 700 other armored vehicles, a testament to the quality of Western equipment and the skill of Ukrainian crews when properly supplied.
However, by early 2024, that Republican-led freeze on U.S. military aid had led to severe supply shortages in the critical Avdiivka sector. Artillery shells, crucial for holding back Russian assaults, and specifically ammunition for the effective Bradley IFVs, became dangerously scarce, making the Ukrainian defensive position increasingly untenable against relentless Russian pressure. On February 18, 2024, the Ukrainian army made the difficult but necessary decision to conduct a tactical withdrawal from the ruins of Avdiivka to avoid encirclement. The Biden administration immediately characterized the loss as the direct cost of congressional inaction on aid. Russian casualties in the 5-month battle for Avdiivka, estimated at about 17,000 killed and 30,000 wounded, tragically exceeded those of the entire 10-year Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, highlighting the staggering human cost of Russia's minimal gains.
On February 8, 2024, just before the Avdiivka withdrawal, Zelensky dismissed General Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's highly popular top military commander, as part of a significant reboot of the war effort, signaling a potential strategic shift. While disagreements between the political leader and the military chief over the future direction of the war had become public knowledge for months, the move was publicly portrayed as amicable, with official photos showing them smiling and shaking hands. Zaluzhny was replaced by General Oleksandr Syrskyi, the ground commander widely credited with successfully orchestrating the defense of Kyiv in early 2022 and the stunning Kharkiv counteroffensive later that year, but also the general who oversaw the costly attritional defense of Bakhmut, making his appointment somewhat controversial.
Russia continued to make slow, grinding, incremental advances in the Donetsk region throughout the spring of 2024, as Ukrainian defenders struggled with those acute supply issues, reportedly facing a devastating 10-to-1 artillery imbalance against the Russians in some critical areas. In April 2024, that long-stalled $60 billion U.S. military aid package was finally approved by the U.S. Congress after months of delay. But the interruption had already allowed Russian forces time to consolidate their gains in the Donbass and, significantly, to reopen fighting in the northern Kharkiv Oblast, forcing Ukraine to divert scarce resources. Despite the renewed aid flow, an expected major Russian offensive in the spring or summer of 2024 failed to materialize on the scale many predicted. An assault aimed at capturing Pokrovsk, a key Ukrainian logistics hub in Donetsk, ground on for months with minimal territorial gains but at enormous human cost for Russia, thousands of Russian troops killed, and reportedly over 1,500 armored vehicles destroyed in that sector alone. The Russians did eventually capture the town of Vuhledar in early October 2024, after more than 2 years of brutal fighting for it. But this minor success was immediately followed by Russia's reported deadliest month of the war so far, in terms of casualties, an estimated 1,500 Russian troops killed or wounded daily without achieving any sizable new territorial gains, highlighting the brutal wheat grinder nature of their offensive strategy.
While Ukraine remained largely on the defensive in the Donbas and Kharkiv regions through much of 2024, a new and completely unexpected front was opened on August 6th. That's when several Ukrainian brigades launched a surprise cross-border incursion deep into Russia itself, capturing dozens of towns and villages in Russia's Kursk Oblast and reportedly causing some 200,000 Russian civilians to flee the border region. Zelensky acknowledged publicly that a major goal of this audacious incursion was to disrupt the tempo of Russian operations on Ukrainian soil by forcing Moscow to divert troops and resources to defend its own territory. And to this end, the invasion appeared to be a tactical success. Russian counteroffensive efforts in Kursk were surprisingly slow and ineffective, showing how stretched their resources had become.
What's truly intriguing here is the immediate international dimension this new front introduced. It was widely reported that some 11,000 North Korean soldiers were dispatched to the Kursk region to assist the struggling Russian war effort, signaling a deepening of military ties between Moscow and Pyongyang, two internationally isolated regimes. South Korean officials immediately interpreted this deployment as a serious direct threat, and President Yoon Suk-yeol signaled that Seoul was now considering sending lethal military aid directly to Ukraine in response, potentially widening the scope and stakes of the conflict significantly. In November 2024, in an effort to further bolster Ukrainian capabilities, particularly for striking targets supporting the Kursk front from within Russia, President Biden lifted the remaining restrictions on the use of ATACMS, that's the U.S.-supplied long-range tactical ballistic missile system, allowing Ukraine to use them against military targets on Russian soil. This significant policy shift came just weeks after Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. presidential election, creating swirling uncertainty around the future of long-term U.S. support for Ukraine. In anticipation of potential policy changes, Biden's Defense Department began that surge of security assistance, rushing to dispatch all remaining congressionally authorized military aid before Trump potentially took office and altered the U.S. commitment.
Beyond the grinding ground battles and the shifting fronts on land, one of the most surprising and, frankly, incredibly successful chapters of this entire war has unfolded on the Black Sea. This is where Ukraine, despite having a virtually non-existent traditional navy after 2014, achieved remarkable, almost unbelievable victories against the vastly superior Russian Black Sea fleet. And finally, as we conclude, we must bring our deep dive to the sobering reality of the immense, almost incalculable human and material cost this conflict has exacted over a brutal decade.
What's truly remarkable here when you look at the naval war is the context. The Ukrainian Navy had virtually ceased to exist as a conventional force after the Russian capture of its main base in Sevastopol back in March 2014. Its surface fleet consisted of only a handful of small patrol boats. Yet, Ukrainian Special Forces units extensively and brilliantly used unmanned surface drones essentially, explosive-laden remote-controlled speedboats, taking a devastatingly heavy toll on Russia's Black Sea fleet. Ukrainian cruise missiles, likely Western-supplied Storm Shadow and Scalp-P missiles, also successfully targeted Russian ships docked in port and even the heavily defended Black Sea Fleet headquarters building in Sevastopol itself, showing surprising reach and precision. One of the ships confirmed destroyed, the Kilo-class attack submarine Rostov-on-Don, struck while in dry dock, represented the first combat loss of a Soviet or Russian submarine since World War II, a truly historic and humiliating naval event for Moscow.
So effective were these strikes, a real David and Goliath story playing out on the waves, that by October 2023, Russia was forced to relocate a major portion of the Black Sea Fleet from its historic base in occupied Crimea all the way east to Novorossiysk in Russia proper. This signaled that their main naval base in Sevastopol was simply no longer safe from Ukrainian attack. But this relocation didn't stop Ukraine's innovative naval campaign. In just 2 weeks, in February 2024, Ukrainian naval drones successfully sunk the Russian missile corvette Ivanovets and the large landing craft Caesar Kunikov off the coast of Crimea, demonstrating their continued asymmetric advantage and technological prowess. By mid-2024, independent analysts estimated that Ukraine had successfully knocked out roughly a third of the entire Black Sea Fleet, destroying at least 25 surface ships and 1 submarine, with over a dozen more ships being damaged so severely that they were forced into port for lengthy repairs, a truly astounding feat for a country effectively without a navy.
Asserting this degree of dominance over the Western Black Sea had an obvious and absolutely vital economic benefit for Ukraine, beyond the military humiliation of Russia. In July 2023, Russia had unilaterally abandoned the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that crucial UN-brokered deal allowing Ukrainian grain exports, clearly attempting to choke Ukraine's economy by blockading its ports. Ukraine responded defiantly just 2 months later in September by unilaterally declaring its own protected maritime shipping route along the western shore of the Black Sea, hugging the coastlines of Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria, all NATO members except Ukraine itself. Critically, the waters along this route were generally too shallow for Russian submarines to operate effectively, and Russian surface vessels were justifiably wary of Ukraine's deadly fleet of naval drones, making them hesitant to approach and interfere with shipping.
And the economic impact of this maritime corridor has been significant, providing a vital lifeline for Ukraine's war-torn economy. By early 2024, cargo volumes moving through deep-water ports such as Odessa were reported to be approaching their pre-war levels. The successful operation of the shipping corridor meant that Ukraine was on pace to export all of the surplus grain that its farmers had harvested in 2023, despite the ongoing war. This was described as a massive boon to Ukraine's economy, forecast to add potentially 1.2% to Ukraine's GDP, showcasing how battlefield innovation and success translated directly into economic survival and resilience.
Now, predictably, neither Ukraine nor Russia has been particularly forthcoming with detailed, accurate casualty statistics throughout this conflict, making the true human toll incredibly difficult to ascertain precisely. However, our sources do provide estimates from various credible organizations that paint an undeniably grim picture. The United Nations estimated that the initial conflict in the Donbass alone between 2014 and the start of the full-scale invasion in early 2022 claimed around 14,000 lives, with roughly a quarter of those killed being civilians. Nearly 40,000 people were estimated wounded during that initial phase, a terrible tragedy even before the full-scale war began.
From the start of the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022 up to the end of November 2023, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights had documented over 10,000 confirmed civilian deaths and 18,500 confirmed wounded. The UN consistently noted that the vast majority of these casualties were caused by Russia's indiscriminate targeting of Ukrainian cities, with explosive weapons having wide area effects, a clear pattern of brutality against non-combatants. An earlier UN report also stressed that the true count of civilian deaths was likely considerably higher, especially in heavily contested cities like Mariupol, where tens of thousands of civilians were believed killed during the siege but couldn't be individually verified. The U.S. Defense Department, in one estimate, suggested some 40,000 civilians might have been killed in total by that point.
Beyond the direct casualties from violence, the displacement caused by the war has been absolutely staggering. An estimated 8 million people fled Ukraine as refugees, seeking safety primarily in Europe. Nearly that many again were internally displaced within Ukraine itself, forced from their homes but remaining within the country's borders. Altogether, this means more than one-third of Ukraine's entire pre-war population was displaced by the fighting a massive humanitarian crisis on a scale not seen in Europe since WWII. The Russian military also carried out the systematic, forcible transfer of between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainian citizens, including, horrifyingly, some 260,000 children, to Russian territory or Russian-controlled areas. This practice, often involving so-called filtration camps, constituted a clear war crime under the Fourth Geneva Convention. International observers noted this mass kidnapping and deportation appeared to be part of a broader campaign of ethnic cleansing by Russia, recalling similar dark efforts seen previously in Russian campaigns in Chechnya and Georgia. The International Criminal Court officially concluded this constituted a war crime in its March 2023 arrest warrant for Putin.
Regarding military casualties, the numbers are highly contested but paint a picture of immense bloodshed on both sides, particularly for Russia. In September 2022, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed a mere 5,937 Russian troops have been killed, a figure instantly dismissed internationally as laughably propagandistically low. However, just before the 2-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion in February 2024, Western intelligence officials estimated that total Russian military casualties, meaning killed and wounded, had likely topped 320,000. This represented nearly 90% of Russia's total mobilized force prior to the war, a staggering and likely unsustainable rate of loss. Additionally, a separate estimate suggested some 40,000 Wagner Group mercenaries had been wounded and perhaps 20,000 killed, highlighting the brutal cost of their involvement, particularly in Bakhmut. Western analysts estimated Ukraine, while also suffering heavy losses, had perhaps incurred around 200,000 military casualties by that time, a significant but comparatively lower toll than Russia's.
Visually confirmed equipment losses, often tracked meticulously by open-source intelligence analysts, are also incredibly stark. and offer a more tangible measure of the conflict's material devastation. Ukraine was visually confirmed to have lost nearly 3,000 armored vehicles, including some 740 tanks by late 2023. Russia's visually confirmed losses, however, were far higher, amounting to over 8,000 armored vehicles destroyed or captured, including a staggering 2,700 tanks, representing a massive destruction of their pre-war military hardware. And here's a fascinating, almost implausible detail noted in our sources. In the first year of the war, Ukraine managed to recoup nearly all of its documented armored losses with captured Russian equipment, including achieving a net gain of more than 90 tanks, thanks to the sheer amount of functioning gear abandoned by fleeing Russian troops, particularly during the Kharkiv route. In less than a year of full-scale war, Western analysts estimated that Russia's overall conventional military capability had already been degraded by half. By 2024, Western intelligence officials estimated that the war had effectively set back Russia's attempts at military modernization by nearly 2 full decades, representing a profound long-term strategic setback for Moscow, regardless of the eventual outcome on the battlefield.
So, after digging through all of this, what does it all really mean for us, for you listening? We've traced a tumultuous decade of escalating conflict, right from the initial Euromaidan protests and the illegal annexation of Crimea, through the grinding, brutal war in Donbass and the shocking full-scale invasion, to the shifting tides of battle, those surprising Ukrainian successes in the Black Sea, and the truly immense, sobering human and material costs. It's an incredibly complex picture, revealing a remarkably resilient Ukraine fiercely defending its sovereignty against an increasingly isolated, yet still dangerous and unpredictable Russia.
Understanding this detailed progression, this decade-long evolution, is absolutely vital for grasping the current geopolitical landscape and, frankly, the future of international security. While many factors and players undoubtedly shaped the conflict along the way, our source material consistently attributes the initial covert invasion of Crimea and the subsequent deliberate escalations in the Donbass, and the eventual full-scale invasion, squarely to decisions made in Moscow. This systematic pattern of escalation set the stage for the protracted and devastating war we continue to witness today. International involvement, while absolutely crucial in sustaining Ukraine's defense, has also faced its own significant political challenges and limitations, highlighting the evolving and sometimes fragile nature of global alliances and long-term commitments in the face of sustained aggression.
Given the unprecedented scale of human suffering and military degradation we've seen on display, and the profound geopolitical shifts that have reshaped alliances and global power dynamics, what might be the lasting implications of this conflict for the future of international security and perhaps the very definition of national sovereignty in the 21st century? It really forces us to ask, how might the hard-won lessons from this long, brutal war reshape our collective understanding of deterrence, the limits of diplomacy, and the fundamental responsibility of the international community to uphold international law in the years and decades to come? We encourage you, as always, to continue reflecting on these insights and to stay informed as this profound, ongoing deep dive into global affairs continues to tragically unfold.